Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Public Programs Director of YIVO, and we're so pleased to have you all here with us, both in person and online, for this celebration of two important new books on Jewish literature, Philip Roth, Stung by Life, and On the Slaughter. We're really pleased to have three really extraordinary people here for this evening, and I'll say a word about each of them in a moment. But for those less familiar with YIVO, I just want to say a word about YIVO to start. YIVO is a very special place for the study and learning and teaching about Jewish history and Jewish culture. At the center of YIVO is our archives and library, which contain over 23 million documents and over 400,000 books chronicling Jewish history and culture, which we make accessible to researchers around the world. And we bring these collections to life and the stories that they tell through programs like this, through classes, through exhibitions, and more. And so thank you so much for joining us. Stephen Zipperstein is the Daniel E. Koshland Professor in Jewish Culture and History at Stanford University. He's the author and editor of 9 books. His most recent is Pogrom, Kishinev, and the Tilt of History, most recent before this book. Named Book of the Year by The Economist and shortlisted for the National Jewish Book Award and the Mark Litton Prize as the best nonfiction book of 2018. Peter Cole is the author of 6 books of poems, most recently Draw Me After, and Hymns and Qualms, New and Selected Poems and Translations, as well as many volumes of translations from Hebrew and Arabic, medieval and modern. Cole has created a body of work that defies traditional distinctions between old and new, foreign and familiar, translation and original. Among his many honors are an American Academy of Arts and Letters Award in Literature, a Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship, a Jewish National Book Award, the Penn Prize in Translation, and in 2007, a MacArthur Fellowship. And finally, Edward Hirsch, a MacArthur Fellow, has published 9 books of poetry, including The Living Fire, New and Selected Poems, and Gabriel, a Poem, a book-length elegy for his son. He has also published 7 books of prose, among them How to Read a Poem and Fall in Love with Poetry, a national bestseller, and 100 Poems to Break Your Heart. He has received numerous prizes, including the National Book Critics Circle Award. A longtime teacher at Wayne State University and in the creative writing program at the University of Houston, Hirsch is now president of the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation. So as I said, 3 extraordinary people. We're very happy to have them here with us. And the books that we're discussing tonight will be on sale in the lobby, and there'll be a signing. And for those that are watching online, they are available from our online bookstore. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Alex. Thank you all for coming. So thrilled to be part of this conversation. We have 2 wonderful books. The first really great translation of Bialik into English, so Peter's done it. I mean, I've always known that Bialik was a great poet, but sorry, Mom and Dad, I just wasn't paying attention in Hebrew school. So just didn't know, only read about it. So Peter's the first book that really shows us what a great poet Bialik is, so eager to talk to him about it. And Steve has written this marvelous short biography of Philip Roth that takes on each one of the books and roots it in Roth's life and does a marvelous job of sifting through all the materials in a complicated life and making sense of it. So we're going to have a conversation about 2 figures who are very unlike each other and see if we can find some common ground between them. But I thought we'd start, I asked Peter to read the title poem of the Bialik book and asked Steve to read something from his biography of Roth.
So it's a little easier to read poetry standing up. I just want to say 1 or 2 things by way of framing really this reading, but the entire conversation on the Bialikian side, which is that this was not a project that I planned or expected to do in any way. It was triggered by October 7th and its aftermath. It kind of surprised me, ambushed me. And one of the things that really struck me immediately after the 7th, in conversations I was having both in Jerusalem, where my wife and I were at the time, and then in New Haven, where we were shortly after that, and it's still happening, and it happened to me last week at an event at Yale, is that I'd find myself in conversation with somebody talking about how we feel about what's happening. And I'd have this feeling that we were on the sort of same wavelength. And then a little bit into the conversation, it would become clear that it wasn't clear that I knew what the referent of this person's conversation was. We were both using the exact same words to talk about how we felt, but it became increasingly suspect to me that perhaps they were thinking something very different than I was. In other words, that there was a kind of floating referent out there in the October 7th plus its aftermath. That is something that I then discovered in Bialik as well. And so there's some way in which this event that triggered the whole project and the essence of Bialik's writing itself, which also may have had something to do with how it is that he became the kind of national figure that he did, they came together. So, on the slaughter. Skies, have mercy. If you hold a God to whom there's a way that I haven't found, pray for me. Me, my heart has died. There is no prayer on my lips. My hope and strength are gone. How long? How much longer? Executioner, here's my neck. Slaughter. Take off my head like a dog's. You've got the axe in the arm, and the world to me is a butcher's block. We whose numbers are small, it's open season on our blood. Crack a skull, let the blood of infant and elder spurt on your chest, and let it remain there forever and ever. If there's justice, let it come now. But if it should come after I've been blotted out beneath the sky, let its throne be cast down. Let the heavens rot in evil everlasting, and you with your cruelty go in your iniquity and live and be bathed in your blood. And cursed be he who cries, revenge. Vengeance like this, for the blood of a child Satan has yet to devise. Let blood flood the abyss. Let it pierce the blackest depths and devour the darkness and eat away and reach the rotting foundations of the earth.
A lesson I just learned: do not agree to do reading after a great poet does his or her reading. You really don't want to be put in that kind of position. I can excuse myself by saying I have a bad cold, so that's why I'm reading so poorly. What I foregrounded in this book is what Philip Roth loved most, which are his books, reading, words, and try to draw a portrait of the interplay between what he wrote and who he was. And actually, I dedicate this session to the first professor who actually took an interest in an Orthodox Jewish boy who stumbled into UCLA and who's sitting right there in the third row, and that's Sam Farber, who has had enormous impact on me. It's lovely to see you. I'm going to do a reading from a couple of paragraphs of my treatment of Roth's book, The Ghostwriter. There'll be no drama at all. Lonov himself, it was widely believed, was meant as a glimpse of Malamud, Bernard Malamud, with the befuddled protagonist, biographer, from his novel Dubin's Lives, published earlier the same year as a ghostwriter, torn between fealty to his wife and the allure of a younger lover. This may have left its impact, but Emanuel Lonov, the writer at the center of the ghostwriter, now obscure, overweight, hidden away with a hopelessly bored wife, most resembles Roth's own sense of how he himself might look in the future. Claire Bloom is no doubt accurate. The relationship was at its height when he was working on the book. When she rejects in her memoir the idea that Lonov is modeled largely on Bernard Malamud or Saul Bellow, insisting, quote, that the writer on whom the portrait was most clearly modeled was Roth himself, end quote. Here is a Roth who has subsisted long in isolation deep in the wilderness, who is fat, much like Mickey Sabbath as portrayed years later, who was caught up in a domestic miasma he could already envision despite his current happiness. Ever since Goodbye Columbus, published in '59, all his books save Portner's complaint had disappointed him. And he could imagine how he too, much like Lonov, who had retreated into, quote, the Goyish wilderness of birds and trees where America began and long ago had ended, end quote, might well face eventual literary oblivion. And spending year after year turning sentences around, he could well imagine his own physical transmutation from a Valentino lookalike, as Lonov is described based on one of his his first book flaps, into flabby middle age, blending irony with the banter typically associated with the likes of Jimmy Durante, who surfaces in the book too. Lonov's most memorable monologue is this dour and astute description of a writer's daily drudgery. I'll quote the paragraph, but the interplay between deep analysis of the routine of a writer and comedy is at the core of the ghostwriter. It's a book that I'm convinced was actually inspired by a joke. What's the joke? Zuckerman comes to visit Lonov. He's in the midst of a crisis. His father seems to have rejected him. He's torn between a commitment to freedom as a writer and attachment to the place he comes from. And he sees this girl at Lonov's house. She's all hair, basically no body, and he convinces himself that she's Anne Frank. And so he then imagines he will woo her. And then he will go home to his father and say, Dad, I've met a girl. I've met a girl when I was in Massachusetts. Not so fast. Is she Jewish? And then the crucial line in the book is she Jewish? She's Anne Frank. A writer's drudgery. Meanwhile, he was saying to me, I turn sentences around, that's my life. I write a sentence, then I turn it around. Then I look at it, and I turn it around again, then I have lunch. Then I come back and write another sentence. Then I have tea and turn the new sentence around. Then I read the two sentences over, and I turn them both around. Then I lie down on my sofa, and I think. Then I get up and throw them out and start from the beginning. And if I knock off from this routine for as long as a day, I'm frantic with boredom and a sense of waste. That's the romance of writing.
Good joke. Both Bialik and Roth seem to me big iconic figures, and a lot of legends accrue around them. They laid a lot of traps, Roth especially laid a lot of traps in terms of biography, but you're not writing about people that were unknown. And I wonder about how you each felt you approached Bialik, who there's so much writing about Bialik and so much legendizing about Bialik. And Roth, not only is there so much written about Roth himself, but Roth himself had such a complicated idea about the relationship between art and life. And I just wonder how each of you handled heading into writing about or translating such an iconic person.
I go first, yeah. Well, to give maybe the easiest, the best way to deal with this question is to start with the end of Bialik's life, he eventually moved grew up in Ukraine, in Russia, lived most of his adult life in Odessa and then Berlin, and only in 1924, when he was already 50, went to Palestine, British Mandate Palestine. He lived there for 10 years. When he died, 100,000 people came to Tel Aviv for his funeral. 100,000 people was half of the Jewish population of the land of Israel at that time. So, I mean, he was larger than life in every respect. But that was for better and worse. So there's how being that kind of icon affected Bialik himself in his own life, which was a very complicated dynamic. And then there, as you asked, Eddie, how that influences the translator or affects the translator's task and the biographer, and the translator as a biographer in a lot of ways. So I think one of the reasons, as I said before, that this project surprised me, and I had no great designs. I had translated a few of Bialik's poems over the years for a book that I had written that I put together, The Poetry of Kabbalah. Some of his poems have Kabbalistic elements in them, a kind of secular Kabbalah. But the legend, that iconic status, the legendary Bialik the national poet, always kind of got in the way of my enthusiasm. There were other poets who spoke to me more, and his reputation was so wound up in the kind of official Israeli Zionist narrative, and that wasn't what interested me about Hebrew literature. Even though I was living in Jerusalem and for a long time, but somehow that whole conversation just seemed far from the poetry, and not that interesting, actually. And Bialik himself in his life had to fight against that. He became, in many respects, and Steve has, in addition to the Roth book and several other books, has also written a fabulous biography of Echad Ha'am. Many of you might know who he is, but he was also Bialik's mentor, sort of the father of cultural or spiritual Zionism, it was called. He first came to the fore when he published a poem. He was probably 18 or 19 years old in Echad Ha'am's magazine in Odessa. And then at the age of 30, when he wrote about the poem that I just read, is a poem about the Kishinev pogrom, which we'll talk about. He wrote 2 poems about the massacre, the pogrom in Kishinev, and that catapulted him to a kind of national fame among European Jews, among Russian Jews. The work was translated into Russian by Vladimir Jabotinsky, which and his Russian was fabulous. Jabotinsky, in addition to all the other things he became, was an incredibly talented writer, kind of spoke many, many languages, a quick study. He was one of the more well-known writers in Russia, in Russian. He learned Hebrew late. Bialik, I believe the translations of Bialik were some of the first translations he did. Like he learned Hebrew in some ways to deal with Bialik.
In a year and a half.
What's that?
In a year and a half.
Yeah, yeah. That also accounts for some of the mistakes, but things he left out. But yeah.
Every translator of Bialik is accused of making mistakes, right, Peter?
Except for Peter.
No, I can point out a few. But in any case, so by the age of 30, he was the national poet. And he was basically a shy person. He came from the boondocks. People loved him, and he was, in his way, gregarious, but he was a loner and an orphan, and that was deep in him. And he both wanted well, maybe not like Roth in this case. He both wanted the attention and didn't want it. For example, and he was constantly rebelling against the expectations that were placed on him as the national poet when he was still in Odessa, and even by the time he came to Palestine, he had really stopped writing poetry, but he was still very active as a cultural figure. but an enormous house was built for him, Beit Bialik House, this kind of Orientalist palace. And within a few years, he moved out of it and rented it out, and he moved to a suburb of Tel Aviv. He wanted just an ordinary, nondescript apartment. So there was that. He was, fighting with that himself. And in his poems, there are many poems about the way he's read and how he's misread. But everybody read everything he wrote, for better and for worse. As translator, yeah, it was a real issue. In a way, I had been living all those years with a statue of Bialik, not Bialik. And it was a statue, as happens to statues, a lot of bird droppings, right? There's a lot of guano accumulating, a lot of crud, a lot of stuff. And in order I had sort of made my contact with this poem on the slaughter that I read and with the poems I had translated from the poetry of Kabbalah. But I realized in order to get back to, if I was going to do a larger project, and especially make my way towards the long Kishinev poem, City of Slaughter, I was going to have to find a way in, through that crud, past the statue, back to that kind of lonely guy who showed up in Odessa at age 18 or 19 and listened to the poems. And that was, I call that, in some ways, the translation before the translation. Right? There's a lot of preparatory work that went into just listening to the poems, reading them over and over again, and then kind of letting the crud wash away.
Fighting your way through the tangle.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, this may seem on the surface like a strange coupling, but it's not really, it seems to me. Both writers made their reputation from works, Goodbye Columbus in Roth's case, his novella that he writes in the late 50s, Bialik, Bir HaRega, The City of Slaughter, from work that was, on the surface at least, seemed transparently realistic. I mean, I before writing this book, I wrote a book, Kishinev, Pogrom Kishinev, The Tilt of History, and I actually was able to get hold of the map that Bialik used in traversing the city. He was in Kishinev for 5 weeks, collecting data from pogrom victims and bystanders, and it's on one level an incredibly realistic portrait, much like Goodbye Columbus is on the surface a profoundly realistic portrait, so realistic that Roth worried after the appearance of the book that Goodbye Columbus was published in, that he would be seen as too fluent. He'd be seen as a counterpart to the New Yorker writer whose name now escapes me. It was one of those moments. But he was worried that he'd be seen as a middle-brow writer, precisely because of his fluency. And he was criticized, actually by some critics, for not actually writing a novella, but writing little more than a memoir. So there was this similarity between the two of them, and both of them made their reputations from work that criticized rather bitterly, in many ways, Jews themselves. And certainly Goodbye Columbus, and certainly
Eli the Fanatic is similar.
Right. Well, Eli the Fanatic, I mean, that was a story a story he included in the collection Goodbye Columbus, and is inspired by the story of Gentiles in a rather tony suburb of New York who were protesting against the presence of a rabbinical school. Once Roth read a description of this, he turned those protesting into Jews. And so both were criticized for being too hard on their own people, and then both emerged in one way or another as writers who were seen as the quintessence, Jewish writers, as the quintessence of their moment. And so there's more similarity than meets the eye. I don't know if you'd agree.
No, absolutely. It's suddenly flashing back to when I lived in San Francisco. I once went to the Jewish library there. I mean, I used to go a lot, but when Patrimony came out. And I took out Patrimony, and as I was checking it out, the librarian said, "Oh, you don't want to read that book. It's nasty. He's very bad to our people."
Wait, you were in a library and the librarian urged you not to check out a book.
It's a Jewish library.
You know, I mean, you would think that the one place that actually people encourage one to read is a library, but even in libraries, people are
The point is that
discouraged.
Roth wasn't good for the Jews, right?
Right.
Yeah, and Bialik, well, we're getting there now, but the second Kishinev poem, City of Slaughter, is this long, it's kind of a mini epic where he is, as Steve was saying, Bialik is sent to Odessa, sent to Kishinev by an Odessan historical commission, and again, he's only 30 years old. And he's charged with writing a report on what happened in the pogrom. And he spends, actually, Steve could do this entire program all by himself.
What connected us was I wrote this book built in some measure on the writing of the poet, writing of the poem Bir Haragav, and then Peter and I met, and why don't you take it from there?
So Bialik spends a fair amount of time in Kishinev, and he's got an assistant or two. By all accounts, he's an incredibly sympathetic interviewer. He's interviewing women who've been raped, group raped. Everybody's lost something, family members, property. It was a brutal assault. He's interviewing them in Yiddish, and then he's taking almost all the testimony in Yiddish. And people open up to him, and he wins their trust. And then once he's there, he gathers up what he has, I think about 250 pages of handwritten notes. He retires to his father-in-law's summer place near Kiev, and to write up the report, and he never does it. Instead, he writes this long poem called City of Slaughter, which is his most notorious poem in many ways, in which he uses a lot of the testimony, but he ignores other elements of the testimony. And this is one of the points of contention, a bit like Roth, taking the Gentiles who are upset about the yeshiva in the suburb and saying, no, it's Jews who are upset. So one of the major sort of targets of this long poem is not the Ukrainian seminarians and students and townspeople who perpetrate this pogrom. It's the Jewish community itself who let it happen. And that's where it gets a little complicated, because Bialik knew from taking this testimony that there was Jewish resistance. There were some Jews who tried to defend themselves, tried to defend their women, but he didn't include that in the poem at all. The portrait that he painted of the Kishinev community, and this is a traditional Orthodox community by and large, is of a desiccated, stultified, utterly moribund society and community, one where the danger to itself is not so much that it's not tough, that it doesn't defend itself, but that it's spiritually dead and utterly dried out, right? Again, he's the student of Echad Ha'am, the father of cultural spiritual Zionism. He never mentions, Bialik himself never mentions self-defense in the poem ever. He never mentions weapons. It's not about that. It's about some kind of deeper dignity that is gone. My hope and strength are gone. How long, how much longer? He feels the community is really representative of European Jewry as a whole. So Bialik, the poem then became famous. Maybe I should read a little bit of it, it might help, but the poem became famous in large part for two things. One, because Bialik lied, and two, because, in fact, the poem inspired many units of self-defense to be formed all around the Russian Jewish community. But again, and it became known as that, that's anywhere you read about this poem on the internet, many books, Bialik's biography, that is the reading you will get, that this is a poem calling for self-defense. It's not a poem. I don't read it that way at all. I read it as a much, much more complicated cry for a kind of sympathetic, which I mean active feeling on your senses, a feeling with, on the part of the reader, to what has both happened to the Jews of Kishinev and why it has happened to them.
But in some ways, what he focuses on, the most explosive sections of the poem, have to do with the way in which sons, husbands hide away as their women are being violated. And he was excoriated at the time for these passages in the poem.
Tell them the Shalom Aleichem. You remember that?
Right. I mean, but by a whole array of writers, Mendel Sforim.
That's what I mean.
Right. Savages, the poem, can't stand the poem. What I discovered...
Kafka himself heard a Yiddish translation in Prague and was also very upset by it.
Right, of course. What I discovered in writing my last book was that, so there were two major works that came out of the Kishinev pogrom about Jews, Bialik's poem, and the first book in a Western language that talked about the anguish of Russian Jewry, written by the Irish revolutionary Michael Davitt. And he was a copious note-taker, and I tracked his notes back to Trinity College, Dublin. And I was initially told that the papers were there, the notes, but I couldn't touch them because the paper was too delicate. But I had done a fair amount of research in Russia and learned that if you sit in an archive for 3 or 4 days and you travel to a distant place from California, an archivist takes pity. And so I just sat there, and there's always material to look at. By the 4th day, I was told, yes, you could look at the papers. And David says the same exact thing in his notes, not in the book that he writes about the Kishinev pogrom. And it had the same exact observation as Bialik. And what I concluded, but never included this information in any of his published work about Kishinev, Bialik did. And it's something of a mystery as to why Bialik was the only one who published this information, which was not, he wasn't lying. He was actually telling a certain truth, but not the whole truth. But who tells the whole truth in a poem? And
Or in a novel.
Or in a novel. Yeah, and both of them focus in on certain truths, real truth, while excising others.
Yeah, I mean, and that's still the case today. I mean, there are plenty of scholars. Israel's major literary scholar, Dan Miron, the most senior and knowledgeable of scholars, to this day says this is an abominable poem. It should be, banned from the curriculum. And I mean, teaching Bialik in high schools was another problem. That ruined him for generations of students. But it's not just that in its time people were upset. That kind of controversy, lingers.
What does it mean to be an emblem of Jewish life? There was a story told about Bialik. Bialik, by the time he's in his 40s, he's this exemplar of Jewish culture. And there's a story told about him where he's walking on Friday night in the streets of Tel Aviv and smoking a cigarette. And a couple of young men approach him and say, "You're Hayim Nahman Bialik. You've written about the sanctity of the Sabbath. How could you smoke a cigarette on the Sabbath?" And so he begins to exhort about the importance of the Sabbath in Jewish culture. And at the end, he looks at the guys and he says, "Do you have a cigarette?" So he was uncomfortable with the totem that he became. And certainly Philip Roth was uncomfortable with a plethora of things that we'll talk about later.
One of the things that's really striking to me is that he set out to write a documentary report, which he did not write, and the poem looks like it's documentary, but he's writing a poem precisely because one assumes the report could not deliver the emotional import that he felt in his experience. And I would say with Roth is it looks documentary. It looks like it's something. And then Roth himself, increasingly, it seems to me, begins to rebel against the documentary quality of it and becomes a kind of fantasist at certain points, but continually moves back and forth between what actually is, what's totally true, and then what's invented or made up.
I think Roth is doing this from the very beginning. I think it's already evident in Goodbye Columbus. So Goodbye Columbus is in many ways, I mean, Roth is a writer of ideas, though the ideas aren't as transparent and blatant as in Saul Bellow. So he's influenced by Reisman's The Lonely Crowd. And what he's trying to do with Brenda Potemkin is to make her into the exemplar of the consumerist person. It's hard to know when you meet someone in their late 80s what they were like at 19. But I've gotten to know Maxim Gorky, who I was hoping would come here tonight. And she was the model for Brenda Potemkin. She meets Roth just out of high school. She claims that she read nothing serious aside from Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. She's overwhelmed and in love with this older man, 4 years older than her. The portrait of Maxim Gorky in Portner's Complaint in Goodbye Columbus is of an overweening, controlling person. I don't believe it was a portrait of Maxim Gorky. It was a portrait that he wanted to write about a woman from Newark who nearly captured his love, but he managed to flee. That's the story. And so on one level, it seems a deeply realistic portrait of life. At another level, well, it's a fiction. And that's what he produces. As he says elsewhere in his work, love is slavery. And it's a book about how love could be slavery, and you try to escape from it.
Yeah, with Bialik, he never published the report. That report, I mean, those notes were never published in his lifetime. They were only published, I believe it was 1980-something. Right?
Years later,
Yeah.
And you can't see them.
No.
I took the curator
Well,
out to
now
dinner.
they've since been published.
I took the
but-
curator out to lunch.
Right.
I fed him. I mean, the guy ended up after several days probably gaining about 15 pounds. And I still could not get into the cellar to see
The
those
difference
notes.
between the archive in Ireland and, yeah.
Maybe you should have taken him to dinner, not lunch.
You're right. That was a mistake.
In any case, once Bialik published this poem, and then it was translated into Russian and became so famous, Achad Ha'am and Dubnow, the other people who were involved with this commission, they actually weren't upset at all because they understood exactly what you just said, Eddie, which is the poem had much more truth value and was far more effective than any report would have been, which would have been, tied to the event, and that would have been the end of that. Maybe I'll just read a short passage because I think we all have read some Roth. Bialik, I think, is probably more of an abstraction for people. Just a short passage from this. And hold on to your hats. This is not a pleasant... I'm going to read the rape scene that we were just talking about. One of the things there's a kind of... well, maybe I'm not going to say anything about it. I'm just going to read it. Let's see, where is that? So the poem is, when you start to read the poem, you don't know who's speaking. to this day, some people argue about who is speaking, but it seems pretty clear that it's God speaking, and he's telling the poet, who is a kind of prophet, much as God spoke to the biblical prophet and to Jonah, go to Nineveh, and prophets are given their charge. He's told to get up and go to this town and to bear witness. So, and as Steve said, Bialik followed the path of the pogrom, and in a certain sense, that's what the poem does as well. But it's God directing the poet as to where he should go. Go down then into the murk of the cellars, where the pure daughters of your people were ravaged one by one. This is 1903, by the way. Think about that. I don't know, people who know the history of European poetry. There's nothing like this being written whatsoever. Go down then into the murk of the cellars, where the pure daughters of your people were ravaged one by one, woman after woman defiled under 7, daughters in front of their mothers, mothers before their daughters' eyes, before the slaughter, during the slaughter, after the slaughter. Under your hand you feel the filthy blanket and the bloody pillow, pits where the wild boars had wallowed, stables for horse-like men, their axes dripping with scalding blood. And behold, in the dark of that same corner, beneath the mortar for making matzah, there behind the barrel, husbands had huddled, grooms and brothers peering from cracks at the gasping sacred bodies beneath the flesh of mules, choking in their impurity, gulping blood from their own throats. As a man has at his meal, the abominable creatures had at their flesh. They lay in their shame, and the husbands looked on and did not stir, and did not stab at their eyes or lose their minds, though maybe they prayed in their way and their hearts, Lord of the world, bring on a miracle now, so this evil won't reach me. And those who survived the defilement and woke from their blood, their entire lives were debased as the light of their world was doused. Body and soul fouled forever, without as within, and their husbands sprang from the hollows and ran to the house of their God and recited in the name of their refuge and strength on high the blessing for miracles. And the priestly line among them came forth, asking their sages, Rabbi, my wife, is she permitted? Forbidden? And all was falling back into place, returning to what had long been. So this is a man who's not, as you asked, not afraid to turn on the community.
It's hard to know who comes off worse, the rapists or the Jewish men who are...
Exactly.
It's an attack on Jewish masculinity, really, as well as an attack on the rapists.
Yeah, I think it's an attack on, and the women are the kind of hidden heroes of this poem in certain respects. Yeah.
You want to appreciate what it's like for a truly distinguished poet to translate the work of a great poet. The first sentence that Peter read, go down into the murk of the cellars. The term murk was not used by any other translator, but it's perfect. It's actually a perfect transmutation of what it is that Bialik was writing. Yeah, and you have examples of that throughout this translation. It's an extraordinary translation.
One of the things I'm trying to do is constantly return the reader to the elemental and sensory aspect. I mean, that's what Bialik's doing, when he goes, the poem starts, get up and go to the city of slaughter and come to the yards and see with your own eyes and run your hands along the fences and trees and stones. He wants you to be there, right? And what I talked about before in terms of the floating referent, like what is this poem about? Clearly it's about Kishinev. But if you read this poem now, after October 7th, this poem has been referred to by every major journalistic organ venue in America, the New Yorker, the New York Times, the New Republic, in Haaretz. The headline, City of Slaughter, was in Haaretz not that long ago, about Gaza City. In other words, Bialik, as I read him now, right, there's a kind of reagent of history here. The poem is reacting with history 100 years later. The poem is on its own. As it was in Bialik's time, right? It came to mean something different maybe than, as all of Bialik's poems did, they came to mean something different. Who's to say this poem is not also now about Gaza? Who's to say this poem is not also about any kind of massacre like this? Bialik wants you to be sensorially in that mix. When, I think, is it you who wrote about this, Steve? Noam Chomsky, after Sabra and Shatila was interviewed somewhere and said, he was talking about the massacre in Lebanon, Beirut, and Sabra and Shatila, where the IDF surrounded the city and let the Christians massacre the Muslims. And Chomsky says, one would think that Jews would have a greater sensitivity to this kind of thing, having gone through Kishinev. That's what he said. Yeah.
One of the things that's striking to me about both of these guys, Roth, it's really striking in your biography to me. Bialik, it's understandable given what he was studying, what he saw. These guys are just crazily obsessed with being Jewish. Like seriously obsessed. Like Roth, it's like so instinctive. Like they never get over the blow. And it just keeps coming back again and again and again. And I'm really interested in your take on this. Like, what do you think is driving this obsessiveness about what it means to be Jewish?
Roth writes about what he knows best. He writes best about men, less well about women. He knows what male bodies are like. As much as he studies female bodies, he knows them less well. He knows Newark well. He had to flee Newark like Joyce flees Dublin in order to write about it. But then he spends the rest of his life ruminating about the flight. And he grows up in a part of Newark that's 95% Jewish. He knows Jews. You know, the notion that that whole generation of writers, Bellow, Malamud, Roth, insisted that they weren't Jewish writers, that was a tick. A useful definition of an American Jewish writer is someone who insists that they're not an American Jewish writer. Because Jewish suggested at the time something tribal, something smaller. You don't have Eudora Welty insisting she's not a Southern writer. You don't have Chekhov insisting that he's not inflected by Southern Russian inflections. You don't have Faulkner insisting he's not a Southern writer. It's this particular Jewish exercise that I'm not small, I belong to the world, I'm writing about Chicago in much the same way, with much the same texture as Faulkner's writing about the South. You should take me seriously. It's not to be taken literally. And he is deeply preoccupied with the mystery of what it means to be Jewish, and it is something mysterious. You know, the notion that Jewishness is an analog of Protestantism or Catholicism is absurd, because most Jews are basically live lives like lapsed Catholics live Catholicism, and yet they're Jewish. Not a single prime minister of Israel, the Jewish state, has attended synagogue outside of an electoral cycle, except for Menachem Begin, and yet it's a Jewish state. And so there's something, I've in thinking about this book and about trying to translate Roth to audiences, I've thought, perhaps bizarrely, about George Santos. Now, George Santos...
That's bizarrely.
George Santos, there was a chachma about George Santos. George Santos understood that to be Jewish, you didn't need to wear a skull cap as a male. You didn't need to go to synagogue. You just needed to act a little bit of Jewish, quite how he did, I don't know. But I mean, to draw a bizarre comparison between George Santos and Philip Roth, I think, is in some ways apt. Because Jews are bizarre. Jews are strange. Jews occupy, I mean, you think about the amount of press attention being given to Jews now, to Epstein, Mossad, certainly Gaza. I mean, Jews are everywhere in the newspapers, and there are fewer Jews in the world than the population of Singapore. So yes, he's preoccupied with this strange people.
But something happened to Roth. I was very struck by it in your biography. Something happened to him when he went to Prague. Yeah. It initiated him into something else.
It did, and to some extent it didn't, yes. He does begin to learn about the underbelly of the fate of Jews. That's true. But
I mean,
Roth,
for literary kids like me, Philip Roth going to Prague changed our lives because he came back and edited writers from the other Europe.
yeah,
And
but
that introduced us to everyone. I mean, that's how
You're
we
right.
found out about Kundera. That's how we found out
it was an extraordinary
Bruno Schultz.
project.
It was an incredible act.
But he's also constantly responding to criticism. He writes, his friend Ted Solotaroff at one point and says, I write a sentence and I ask myself, what will Alfred Kazin think about this? I write the next sentence and I ask myself, what will Bob Alter think about this? So, and to some extent, I'm convinced, and this is an argument I make in my biography, he begins to foreground Kafka in the wake of Irving Howe's attack on him in 1972 in Commentary, where he accuses basically Irving Howe, who was the great kind of presence in American culture at the time, certainly in Jewish writing, he's reviewed Goodbye Columbus favorably. In 1972, he says, I was wrong about Goodbye Columbus. I was wrong about everything. The guy's a lousy writer. But the main criticism he makes that Roth takes seriously is that Roth has a thinness of culture. Now, who could accuse the greatest expert in the English language on Kafka of a thinness of culture? And to some extent, it's an extended response to criticism. He turns that into literary gold, to be sure. And but he's enormously. Just one more comment about his attitude toward criticism. He's enormously thin-skinned, and yet he takes incredible literary risks that are almost certainly works that will be savaged. His work on Nixon could have been put together by a fraternity. And so he has to know that he's going to be attacked. And he's bitter about the attacks. And then he does this time and time again.
Invites it.
Right.
Bialik and Jewishness, I think, is a different kettle of fish, but he's equally obsessive. I mean, it's everything for him. But before I get to that, the whole thing of the mystery of the Jews. First of all, I never heard the word Chochma. I was going to say George Santos and Chochma. I've never heard together.
You came figuring it didn't make sense to actually have a session devoted to Bialik and Roth, and now we threw in George Santos.
So, everything's working.
Off the rails. You've gone off the rails.
No, Freud is the kind of counterpart there of, for Freud, right, who can explain or, knows everything, but the one thing he can never know, and that remains the deep mystery for him, is his Jewishness, right? That's sort of bottomless for him.
So why a humorless man writes this book about jokes, but there are other mysteries about Freud, too.
But it's a good book.
Bialik and Jewishness is very different in the sense that it's all Bialik knows and all he cares about. He's kind of famously uninterested in European culture. I mean, he reads European novels in translation and European poetry in translation. That he's interested in. But for example, when he lives in Berlin, where he's got a publishing house that he's running, he's completely uninterested in Berlin cultural life. And in some senses, that's been one of the things that's kind of held him back, is that he really is so closely tied to the whole of Jewish history and the prospects for the survival of Judaism that you can't conceive of him ever doing a kind of Rothian thing or Malamud, denying. This is the same with the abstract expressionists. They had a big show at the Jewish Museum about Jewish art, and they all stood up and said, there's no such thing as Jewish art. Bialik's not like that.
Guess they'd read Leviticus.
There you go. Yeah. Everything that he did was about Jewishness, the cleaning the stables of Jewishness in order for Jewishness to survive and to go on as a vital culture. Even when he stopped writing poetry, which he did more or less age 40, something like that, and it had already slowed down quite a bit, he spent the rest of his life in this massive cultural project he called Kinus, ingathering, trying to gather up the great works of the Jewish past in all fields, rabbinics, poetry, editions of the medieval poets. That's where my first point of contact with Bialik that really lit me up was when I was translating medieval Hebrew poetry for the first time. Shmuel Hanagid, the first great poet of that period, 11th century Spain. I read a letter that Bialik wrote to a friend of his when he heard, not just heard, but when he was given a crate of manuscripts that had Hanagid's poems in them that had been lost for 1,000 years. And he said, you know, I think he's writing to Revnitsky, he said, "You will not believe what is in this crate. How could these pearls like this have rolled around in the trash heap of Jewish history? You know, this is one of the great figures." And he's just, everything about him is a kind of construction, a project of construction of Jewishness in a positive sense, but a positivity that also includes, like you say, cleaning out the stables and calling a spade a spade. When something's dead, it's dead.
There's something almost counterintuitive about the emergence of both of them. You know, Bialik is rusticated. He's not terribly well educated. He doesn't command rabbinic literature. Friends of his insisted that this is not an extraordinarily learned man. Roth is a B- student in high school. He graduates high school without any clear direction. His father suggests he learn Spanish. Roth never learned a foreign language. He learned Spanish because Jews controlled the banana industry. A Jew is the owner of Chiquita Bananas at the time, and maybe he can get a job peddling bananas. You know,
Plastics, bananas.
Yeah. And then one of them becomes Philip Roth, and the other one becomes Hayim Nahman Bialik. You know, and so where, if you will, genius comes from is so mysterious.
Yeah, Benjamin Harshav, a scholar of Yiddish, wrote that it's noteworthy that Bialik did not come from a shtetl. He came from this tiny town called Radi in the Ukraine. I forget, 10 huts or something, and it's him in nature and that kind of deep romanticism and loneness. He didn't, it gave him this outsider's perspective and created in him a kind of hunger that was never satiated.
Should we open up?
Yeah, I wonder if we should open it up to you and see if you have any questions.
Yeah.
If you want to yell at anyone, yell at one of them.
It's just an observation that has come to me listening to both of you. Having lived in Israel, I learned to memorize Bialik. He's a saint for many Jews.
This is the problem.
Having said, no,
That should have been the subtitle. A saint for many Jews.
well, thank you. I take full credit for that. What I wanted to say and to ask is, there seems to be a pole star here. You have on the one hand Bialik, who was born and bred in Europe before the middle of the 20th century, who had ties to the late 19th century, when you had the extreme anti-Semitism in France, and you had the famous thank you, the Dreyfus Affair. I should know, I wrote about it. The Dreyfus Affair. And then you had all these other extreme forms of violence against Jews all over. Okay, then you have the establishment of the State of Israel, and then you have the American Jewish form of narcissistic intellectualism, with the writers you mentioned, and I would also add Chaim Grade, I would like to just say that Israel seems to be the common denominator between the two. On the one hand, you have Jews as victims. On the other hand, you have the victim becomes the victimizer to some extent, and sometimes is forced into that kind of position. Now, I don't have a problem with Roth, Bellow, Malamud, Chaim Grade, etc., but they were born in the post-war American century, the second half. Things were pretty good here. What do you see as the driving catalyst in their work? What made them tick, basically, both of them, aside from, as you said about Bialik, preserving Jewishness, and what was it for Roth?
Well, one thing I'd say, first of all, is that obviously Bialik is keenly aware of all these anti-Jewish movements throughout Europe. But curiously enough, and I mean, he leaves Russia only when he has to after the Russian Revolution. And he and a bunch of Odessan Jewish writers are given a permit. Gorky helped them get out to go to Istanbul. Everybody except Bialik and his wife went to Palestine. Bialik goes to Berlin. He has business to do for his publishing company for this Kinus project. In Berlin, he only leaves Berlin when things get bad in Berlin. As he said to a young colleague who, in 1903, after the Kishinev pogrom, offered him a job in Palestine teaching at a school that was founded for the orphans of Kishinev, my heart is in the diaspora. He understood that even as a great sort of early Zionist figure, he knew where home was for him until it was no longer possible to live in any of these places. So I'll just leave it with that.
I mean, partly his love was in the diaspora at that moment because he falls in love in Kishinev and has an affair, which is kept secret until after his wife dies, many years after he does. But so what makes Roth tick? Okay, that's my challenge now, right? So I've long felt that at least many of the artists, the musicians that I most admire circle around one wound and keep circling around it. And the fundamental difference between a neurotic and an artist is what you do with it. And what's Roth's wound, and what does he do with it? He's convinced from the outset that American Jewish life is as Jewish as any Jewish experience, and it's a good experience. And Jews are safe in America. And Jews are unwilling to recognize, does any of this sound familiar, given the election last week, that Jews are unwilling to recognize that by and large they are safe. And there's a certain comfort that some of us feel in discomfort. And he seeks to challenge that. We can argue about that later on. I think we'll be arguing about this election for the next many decades. But the other wound that he circles around, and I'm not going to blame it on the mother. Okay, I'm not. However, here is this writer who deals extensively with schmutz, with what lies underneath things of beauty. Think about the making of gloves in American Pastoral. Think about his portrayal of his father's feces in Patrimony. He grows up in a home where he and his brother Sandy don't use the bathrooms of their friends because no bathroom is as clean as theirs. His mother, Bess, one of his lovers, Barbara Sproul, told me the story, which I think I included in my book. She claimed when she was staying over in Connecticut visiting with them, She claims that she had never seen a dishwasher. And Barbara Sproul showed her how a dishwasher works. Barbara hears noise, 3 o'clock in the morning, goes down to the kitchen, and Bess is re-cleaning every single dish. That this is the mother of the person who studied schmutz more assiduously, more thoroughly than anyone else that one could think of in American Jewish writing. So I think these are, if you will, some of the wounds that he circles around. He circles around America as a comfortable enough place where you could write about Jews who do bad things, who would commit adultery, who are human beings. He's convinced that one could do that. And he also, just one more note about that, the most controversial short story that he writes early on is called Defender of the Faith. It's about a shirker in the army. And it was bitterly criticized by some because anti-Semites would charge Jews as having been shirkers during the Second World War, during the Korean War. It turns out, as I learned from some of his army buddies, that Roth himself insinuates himself into the story. Roth told his commanding officer that he couldn't do duty on Friday nights because he had to go to shul. Now, Philip Roth, I've studied him now for 6 years. This is not a guy who goes to shul on Friday nights. And so he's willing to write essentially about himself. And he does this throughout his entire life, including his last books where he talks about the diminishment of old age and the diminishment of talent. How many of us are willing to actually look at that, face that? And so I think to the extent to which one could identify the sort of salient, long-standing preoccupations of his, they're not Dreyfus. They're what I've indicated.
Hey, thanks so much. So I haven't read both books yet. I plan to read your books, but I did just finish reading the translation of the Bialik poems, and I'm dropping it on the floor. And I'm interested in, so this is more to Peter, but please, everyone, feel free to weigh in. I'm interested in your idea of the floating referent and how that relates to the task of the translator. And in your introduction, I was really interested to learn about the Palestinian writer Rashid Hussein's translation of Bialik, I think in the 70s, which was commissioned, but which he was not dispassionate about. And then on the other side of that, I was interested in reading your endnote about Jabotinsky, and I was really struck by the line in The City of Slaughter about the phrase iron wall, which is a phrase that I had always thought Jabotinsky was a chiddush that Jabotinsky originated, and I was wondering whether or not we know if that's in fact where Jabotinsky got this idea from, but also just noting the total irony. People talked about Bibi Netanyahu's selective quote from On the Slaughter, but I think the Jabotinsky, the iron wall line is, even more ironic maybe because it's talking about you'll build a fortress, a steadfast iron wall of murderous rage and hell's hatred and pent-up loathing. The first words of the poem are kum lech lecha. It's obviously in a prophetic tradition, so I thought that was so fascinating, and I hadn't seen any writing on that before. So if you just speak to that, I know that's a lot.
So I'll try to go through those quickly. I didn't have the Jabotinsky in mind when I translated that. That's nice to know. Also, I believe in these kind of things come together on their own unconsciously, and maybe it was Jabotinsky in my mind as I read that, and maybe Jabotinsky got it from Bialik. I just don't know. But that passage about the kind of pent-up anger and rage from that same passage, that's exactly an example of a floating referent. You read that today, and you want an explanation for October 7th? That, you cannot, just let me pontificate for a second. Since I've been waiting all evening, you can't treat people, you can't lock a population up in a place like Gaza all those years and not expect rage to build up and explode. Right? What you do about it is a political question, but you can't expect that it's not going to happen. And Bialik is obviously not writing about Palestinians, But the description of Jews right there is one that very easily kind of, it's like the electrons jump orbits, and they're now in a different matrix. And that happens throughout the poem. Even in that little poem he wrote, The Bird, a famous poem when he's 18 years old, and he's writing the bird that comes from the east, and he says he assumes that the bird that he meets in wherever he is living then, somewhere in the rural Ukraine, and says, he's writing, you come from the land of the sun. Has something there gone wrong? That's 1903, right? No, that's 1890, I think, yeah. And the first question you asked was, the thing about Rashid Hussein. So very briefly, just for people in the audience, Rashid Hussein was a very charismatic Palestinian writer and poet, and was given a commission by the Israeli, one of the universities in Israel, or maybe even the Ministry of Education, to translate Bialik into Arabic. And in particular, that poem on the slaughter that I read, he translated and he said, and he saw it as speaking for Palestinians. Executioner, here's my neck, slaughter. Right? You've got the axe in the arm. This is any vulnerable, powerless person, population. And there was a kind of, and the poem also resurfaced during Sabra and Shatila, that in Arabic. So yeah, the fact that Rashid Hussein could not only translate the meaning and sort of take that onto his own national cause, personal cause, he also translated it into the classical Arabic poetics. It just fit very nicely into that. And those kind of things interest me, that's a different kind of translatability of feeling, of personal feeling that reaches the kind of national dimension as well.
It's worth also just saying a word about both writers as political writers. Roth neither actually saw themselves as political writers. Roth insisted that there was an absolute chasm between politics and literature, and writes about this extensively in his book, I Married a Communist. And at the same time, both write works that have enormous political ramifications. And The Plot Against America, the last novel of Roth's is Nemesis, about a plague. He dies in 2018. We know what happens in 2018. I think the most political aspect of Roth's work that rings contemporary today is his insistence on the importance of language, the insistence on the clarity of language, and especially given the person who now inhabits the White House, part of it obliterated, is the contrast between his insistence on language and what actually we hear daily from there is enormously important. It's important to think about. And so for both of them, politics isn't something that preoccupies them, and yet their work has, in each in their own way, enormous political ramifications, as Peter just indicated.
Jacob. Where's Jacob?
Thanks. Yeah, I was thinking about, hearing about these two writers' sort of obsession with their own Jewish identity and deep kind of internal critique of Jewishness. And I was curious to hear from you both if you see Roth and Bialik also offering any sort of positive vision of what if that critique were to be taken, what would they want sort of Jewishness to become?
Something, just a normal aspect of what it means to be a human being. And that Jews, there was a moment, I read about this, a moment that he experiences at Yeshiva University in 1962 that he describes as comparable to Spinoza's excommunication. Salman Rushdie says what he experienced was worse than what I experienced, which is really saying something. It turns out the audience loved him. I found a tape of the event. all that Roth remembered about the event was how the people who didn't particularly like him rushed to the stage afterwards to tell him that they didn't like him. I've come to believe that that's, from my own experience in speaking, that that's as Jewish a manifestation as Passover Seder. And so I think what his basic message about Jewishness is just the natural clothes you wear. And one is blessed in actually wearing them in a place that is as benevolent and safe, despite anti-Semitism that he recognizes when he's a young man, that he writes about when he's an old man. Despite all this, that the Jewish experience can't be understood as synonymous with misery, and I think that's as accurate a lesson I think he extracts as I can think of.
Yeah,
I
I
like
think
the wasp joke.
Pardon me?
The wasp joke.
I'm sorry.
The wasp joke.
The wasp. What? I'm sorry.
So he was in the hospital, or one of his friends, one of his lovers, said that she killed the biggest wasp.
Oh, that. Oh.
George
Yeah,
Plimpton.
George Plimpton. He said, "I thought that was George Plimpton."
Yeah. So I just killed the biggest wasp, George Plimpton.
He said, "I
Yeah,
thought that was George
yeah.
Plimpton." I thought that was pretty funny.
Yeah, he at one point toward the end of his life, we're talking about this biography of Bernard Malamud by a friend of mine, Philip Davis, and I liked the book more than he liked it. He was a little bit insulted by the book. He was very touchy. Anyway, so I said to the extent to which the book stumbles, I think the biographer came to like Bernard Malamud more than a biographer should, and immediately he looked at me and he said, "I have nothing to worry on that score from you, do I?" So
That's a complicated question.
Pardon me?
Very complicated formulation of the question.
Yeah, he was capable of that. Yeah.
I think Bialik's very different in that respect. I've read the two poems that fit very much in the whole sort of lachrymose, neo-lachrymose tradition of Jewish suffering and trial and pain. But Bialik was also an incredibly joyous poet. A few months after Kishinev, he writes poems of such kind of phenomenal, sort of secular revelation. I'll just pick just the beginning of one to give you a sense of.
Plus children's poems.
Children's poems. He's writing poems for children that don't exist. Children don't speak Hebrew at the time when he's writing, essentially. And yet he writes poems in Hebrew for when they will need them. And they're still, sung to this day. Here's a poem from 1903, right after Kishinev, like a few months later. It's called News. The light clouds grow lighter, the clear clouds still more clear. Avenues into a new blue are being revealed. I lift my eyes higher, a curtain is being raised, and with the heavens themselves, I'm speaking face to face. It goes on. But the same guy who did all those sort of poems of suffering, there's tremendous joy and absorption of nature in a kind of Wordsworthian way in him. There is that sort of containing multitudes in him. But I think one of the differences, and he also did believe in this kind of normality, right? Famous that I think it's Bialik who said, we'll know that whatever Zionism is working when we have Jewish thieves and Jewish, all registers of society.
And it's worked.
Yeah, it's worked. It's worked. As I said, the floating referent, it just wanders away. But I think what does distinguish him is he believed, he was a cultural Zionist. He believed deeply in Jewish learning, like just the power, the importance, the metaphysical importance of learning and of Jewish learning is what he really devoted his entire life to, and as I said, that project, and he gave of himself endlessly. It kind of killed him in a certain way, but he could not stop giving for the sake of learning. And I think that positive idea, all these other things, these sort of recounting of sorrows, he rehearses the sorrows in order to move past them.
You know, one other similarity that comes to mind is writer as celebrity, which may sound utterly foreign today. But the writer who is as charismatic as Mick Jagger. I remember reading this story about Bialik, where there was this Jew in Tel Aviv who very much wanted to be with him. This apropos of 100,000 people going to funerals. Jews in that time loved going to funerals. and so, yeah. But in any event, so there's this Jew who really wants to be with Bialik. And Ravnitsky, who was his close friend, arranges for him to come and to sit with Bialik. And the man sits down and says nothing. He had nothing to say. He had nothing to ask. He just wanted to be near Mick Jagger. And so, you know, both of them come of age at a moment very different from today, where it's writers who are the celebrities. And both actually experience this, each in their own way.
Yeah, I mean, his name is basically, you say Bialik, you mean poetry.
Right.
Should we have, is there a last question?
It's a YIVO event. Could you talk about Bialik's use of Hebrew and Hebrew poetics, where he fits into the history of Hebrew? I think you were talking about Roth's language, and you're talking about European, I guess, Western civilization poetics. But how does Bialik's use of Hebrew, a city of slaughter, fit into that?
Yeah, so, I mean, as I said before, he spoke Yiddish. He learned Russian, he learned German. Yiddish was the language he was most comfortable in. He said, Hebrew needs to be spoken, Yiddish speaks itself. Right? But he devoted himself, there were language wars. Should the language of Zionism, or of the Jews, period, be Yiddish, should it be Hebrew? He was very adamant that it needs to be Hebrew, and for its extension into history and all that, the entire kind of cultural baggage that comes with it. But I think it's important to remember that his Hebrew was deeply inflected by Yiddish. The pronunciation, and this is maybe a little too specialized, but it's also very elemental. Those of you who know of, Sephardic pronunciation of Hebrew versus Old Ashkenazic, so Allen Ginsberg in Kaddish says Yiskadal v'Yiskadash, right? And so not Yitkadal v'Yitkadash, so there's syllables that sound different, but also the accent is placed in Sephardic and modern Hebrew, it's placed usually on the last syllable of a word. Boom. Ben-Gurion said, yes, a masculine ending, Jewish strength, Jewish power. The Yiddish words and the Yiddish rhythms, they tend to be falling rhythms. And so he was using Hebrew, but kind of smuggling Yiddish and its intimacy and its mamaloshin and its feminine dimension into the Hebrew, and creates these, I think of them as these pockets of silence. He's a rhythmic master and just virtuoso of the language. And there's something utterly spellbinding about what he did. So even when he made a kind of clear-cut decision that Hebrew was going to be what he goes with, it's a Yiddishified Hebrew, Yiddishized Hebrew.
So why speak about Philip Roth at YIVO? His Hebrew is utterly imperfect. His Yiddish is imperfect. But one of the closest students of Philip Roth's work is now the executive director of YIVO, Jonathan Brent, who's written wonderful things about Philip Roth, was close to Philip Roth for years. And it seems to me that's one important reason why this talk belongs here. You could have said a Yiddish sentence to Philip, and he would have scratched his head. And anything else to say?
Why don't you close it? Why don't take us out with a poem?
That actually sort of embodies the Yiddish inside the Hebrew, inside the English. that in some ways sums up a lot of the things we've been talking about. Is that this would appear, it's called Bring Me In Under Your Wing. It's super famous in Hebrew. You go on the internet, there's all kinds of schmaltzy musical versions of this poem. They're disgusting. Saccharine, it's just like, but that's what people know these days. But this is a poem that seems to be incredibly personal as you could possibly get. Is it about his mother? Is it about the lover that you mentioned? Is it about his wife? It's about all of these things. Is it about his Jewishness? Is it about the Shekhinah, the feminine dimension of the divine, which runs throughout all his poetry as like almost kind of compensatory thing? Is it about the state of the Jewish people? All these things are in this poem. It goes like this. Bring me in under your wing, be sister for me and mother, the place of you rest for my head, a nest for my unwanted prayers. At the hour of mercy, at dusk, we'll talk of my secret pain. They say there's youth in the world. What happened to mine? And another thing, a clue. My being was seared in a flame. They say there's love all around. What do they mean? The stars betrayed me. There was a dream which also has passed. Now in the world I have nothing, not a thing. Bring me in under your wing. Be sister for me and mother. The place of you rest for my head. A nest for my unwanted prayers.
And let me end with a little bit of schmutz. So that was a word that Philip did know. So I explain at the end of my introduction how my book differs from Blake Bailey's 2021 ill-fated biography. And I offered the following example. A telling example is found in Bailey's treatment of Roth's once close friendship with the novelist Alan Lulchik. Although he admired Lulchik for his daring on and off the page and his late-night sexual escapades, Roth limited even his restaurant meals typically to no more than 2 weekly, ever fearful they would interfere with his strict writing routine. Bailey cites accurately a letter to Lulchik of the late 1960s among Roth's papers in the Library of Congress. The woman mentioned is Alice Denham, who stands out in the history of Playboy magazine as the only woman to have published a short story in the same issue where she was featured as a nude. Later, she would publish the book Sleeping with Bad Boys, detailing her sexual encounters with many of the leading writers of her day, including Roth. In the letter, Roth writes, Lulchik, this is Roth, I'm quoting, not me. Roth writes, I wouldn't put my dick in Alice Denham if I were you. You might want to apply for Guggenheim someday. You tell us later on whether the Guggenheim Foundation has changed. And I understand that Henry Allen Lowe, the foundation's 75-year-old president, is hot for her. It's typed and 1.5 pages. And it's what Bailey chooses not to quote or mention that illustrates a fundamental difference between our books. Here in a letter written nearly a decade before The Ghostwriter, widely considered among Roth's finest books, there's a foretaste of its eventual plot and even a glimpse of the makings of American Pastoral, which would appear nearly 30 years later, but started around this time and was put aside. And while Roth's interest in his friend Lulchik's sexual experience arguably deserves some mention in his biography, there was nothing of greater importance to Roth in his books, his true loves, and the only reason that justifies spending years of one's own life writing and rewriting a book about him. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.